Did you know, among everyone who has ever walked this earth, there was one person who knew the Messenger of Allah long before the world knew him as a prophet? He didn't know the prophet through history, he knew him through everyday life. He watched him begin each morning. He heard him speak, laugh, and pray. He grew up under the same roof, learning not from lessons, but from the way the prophet lived every single day, year after year. Then revelation came, and when the world struggled to understand who Prophet Muhammad truly was, one young boy never doubted him, not for a single moment. Because long before anyone called him the Messenger of Allah, that boy had already witnessed his honesty, his mercy, and his character. His name was Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin, the child raised in his home. When I first discovered this part of Ali's story, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Like many people, I had always known Ali as the Prophet's cousin, his son-in-law, one of Islam's greatest warriors, and later, the fourth rightly guided Caliph. But I had overlooked the beginning. Because before Ali became any of those things, he was simply a young boy growing up beside the greatest man who ever lived. So how did that happen? Why was Ali living in the Prophet's home in the first place? To answer that, we have to return to Makkah. Years before revelation, years before Islam. At the time, Makkah was the beating heart of Arabia. Trade caravans arrived from every direction, merchants filled its markets, and pilgrims gathered around the Kaaba throughout the year. It was a city of influence, reputation, and powerful families. Among the most respected of them was Banu Hashim. Not because they were the wealthiest, but because they were known for honor, generosity, and their service to the pilgrims who visited the sacred house. At the head of that family stood a man whose name was respected throughout Makkah, Abdul Muttalib. The leader of Makkah, the guardian of the Kaaba, and the grandfather of Prophet Muhammad. After Abdul Muttalib passed away, much of that responsibility fell to one of his sons, Abu Talib. He inherited his father's responsibilities, but not his wealth. Although respected by the Quraysh, Abu Talib lived a modest life. He had a large family to care for, and providing for them was never easy. Yet this was the same man who had once opened his home to a young orphan. When Prophet Muhammad lost his grandfather, it was Abu Talib who took him in. He didn't see him as a burden. He raised him like one of his own children. He protected him, supported him, and stood beside him through every hardship. The years passed, and that orphan became the man everyone in Makkah trusted. People called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy. By then, Allah had blessed Prophet Muhammad with a peaceful home through his marriage to Khadijah. Life had become more stable, but there was one thing he never forgot: the kindness of Abu Talib, the home that welcomed him, the man who stood beside him when he had no father. The Prophet never forgot a kindness, and when difficult times struck Makkah once again, Abu Talib found himself carrying a burden that had become almost impossible to bear. He had many mouths to feed, many children to raise. Seeing his uncle's hardship, Prophet Muhammad decided it was time to repay a debt that could never truly be measured. Together with his uncle Al-Abbas, he proposed a simple solution. Each of them would take one of Abu Talib's sons into their own household, helping to ease the burden until times became easier. Al-Abbas welcomed Jafar. The Prophet welcomed another little boy. His name was Ali ibn Abi Talib. It seemed like a small act of gratitude. No speeches, no celebration, just one child walking into a new home. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing more than a simple act of kindness. But history often begins so quietly that no one notices. From that day on, Ali no longer visited the Prophet's home. It became his home. At first, it probably didn't feel like history. It felt like family. Every morning, Ali woke beneath the same roof as Prophet Muhammad. He watched him leave for work, welcomed him home at the end of the day, and shared countless ordinary moments that seemed no different from any other family. There were no formal lessons, no long speeches. No one sat Ali down and said, "Watch him carefully. One day the world will follow this man." Life doesn't happen that way. Children don't grow by listening alone. They grow by watching. And every single day, Ali was watching the finest example Allah would ever give to humanity. He saw how the Prophet spoke to people, how he listened before he answered, how he never broke a promise, how he treated the poor with the same dignity as the wealthy, how he honored his relatives, how he welcomed guests, and how he showed kindness even when kindness wasn't returned. None of these moments seemed extraordinary at the time. They were simply part of everyday life. But looking back, perhaps that is what makes this story so remarkable. The world would come to know the Prophet through revelation. Ali first knew him through his character. Before he witnessed miracles, he witnessed honesty. Before he heard the Quran, he witnessed mercy. Before he understood prophethood, he understood the man. Years passed, and without realizing it, Ali was being shaped by everything he saw. Not through commands, not through lectures, but through quiet, consistent example. Sometimes we imagine that great people are formed in great moments. History tells a different story. More often than not, great people are formed in ordinary days. One conversation, one act of kindness, one lesson lived, again and again. That was Ali's childhood. Not a palace, not a school of scholars, just a modest home filled with truth, trust, and compassion. Brick by brick, day by day, character before words, example before instruction. Looking back, it's easy to understand why Ali never hesitated when Islam was revealed. His faith did not begin on the night revelation came. Its roots had been growing for years, inside that home. Then, one night, everything changed. As he had done many times before, Prophet Muhammad left for the cave of Hira, seeking solitude and worship. For the people of Makkah, it was an ordinary night. For Ali, it was an ordinary night. Neither of them knew that before dawn broke over the mountains, Allah would begin revealing the final message to mankind. And the home Ali had been raised in would never be the same again. Before dawn broke over the mountains of Makkah, Prophet Muhammad was alone in the cave of Hira. He had climbed those rocky paths many times before, leaving behind the noise of the city to spend long hours in worship. Nothing about the journey seemed unusual. The mountain was the same. The cave was the same. But that night, everything inside it was different. The angel Jibril appeared before him. "Read." The Prophet replied that he could not read. The command came again, then a third time. Finally, the first words of the Quran were revealed. Not in the marketplace where thousands could hear them, not before the chiefs of Quraysh, but inside a quiet cave where only one man heard the words that would one day reach every corner of the world. When the Prophet returned to Makkah, he was trembling. He entered his home and said, "Cover me, cover me." Khadija wrapped him in a cloak and listened as he described everything that had happened. She did not ask whether he was telling the truth. She already knew the answer. She had lived beside him for years. She had seen how he treated family, neighbors, travelers, and the poor. The revelation was new. His character was not. In that same house, another pair of eyes had been watching the very same man for years. Ali ibn Abi Talib. To Makkah, he was just a young boy living with his uncle. No one looked at him twice. No one imagined he would become one of the greatest companions in Islamic history. But history rarely announces itself. It often begins in places that seem completely ordinary. Not long afterward, Ali saw the Prophet and Khadija praying together. They stood, bowed, and prostrated in a way he had never seen before. It was unlike anything practiced around the Kaaba. Curious, Ali asked what they were doing. The Prophet explained that Allah alone deserved worship, and that he had been chosen as his messenger. Ali did not answer immediately. He thought about what he had heard. By the next day, his decision was made. He believed. There were no crowds applauding his choice, no growing movement promising success. In fact, almost everyone around him still worshipped idols. So why did he believe? Because before Ali trusted the message, he trusted the man who carried it. For years, he had watched the Prophet inside his own home. Public reputation and private character were the same. The honesty that Makkah admired was the honesty Ali had seen at breakfast, at supper, in conversation, and in silence. Character came before words. The first circle of believers was remarkably small. Prophet Muhammad, Khadija, Ali, and soon Zayd ibn Haritha and Abu Bakr. They prayed quietly while the rest of Makkah carried on as if nothing had changed. The markets were still crowded. Caravans still crossed the desert. Pilgrims still walked around the Kaaba, surrounded by idols. But beneath that ordinary life, a new chapter had already begun. Years later, people would remember battles, treaties, and victories. Few would remember these quiet days, when faith was growing one heart at a time. Then came the command to proclaim Islam openly. The Prophet climbed Mount Safa and called Quraysh together. They admitted they had never known him to lie. Moments later, many of those same people rejected his message. The man had not changed. Their hearts had. Mockery turned into persecution. Some believers were beaten, others were tortured. Families were divided. Ali watched all of it. He was no longer the little boy who had entered the Prophet's home. Every hardship became another lesson. Not lessons spoken, but lessons lived. Abu Talib refused to abandon his nephew. When pressure failed, Quraysh isolated Banu Hashim in a harsh boycott. Hunger replaced comfort. Scarcity replaced normal life. The child who had once entered the Prophet's home because of hardship was now sharing hardship beside the man who had raised him. When the boycott finally ended, relief did not last long. Abu Talib passed away. Soon afterward, Khadija also returned to Allah. The home that had shaped Ali's childhood suddenly felt much quieter. Yet the mission never stopped. One by one, people from Yathrib accepted Islam. One by one, the believers quietly left Makkah. The Prophet remained, and Ali remained beside him. Then Quraysh reached a final decision. They would kill the Prophet before he could leave the city. That night, the Prophet asked Ali to sleep in his bed beneath his cloak. Outside, armed men waited in the darkness. Inside, a young man quietly lay down, fully aware of what could happen before sunrise. The Prophet also entrusted Ali with one final task: return every item that Quraysh had left in his care. The irony is impossible to miss. The same people who wanted him dead still trusted him with their valuables. Ali fulfilled every trust exactly as he had been instructed. Only then did he leave Makkah. Years earlier, he had entered the Prophet's home as a child in need of care. He left it as a man willing to risk everything for the messenger of Allah. And the journey to Medina was only the beginning. When Prophet Muhammad arrived in Medina, Ali arrived soon after him. He had stayed behind in Makkah for one reason alone: to return every trust the Prophet had left in his care. Medina felt different. The streets were different. The people were different. For the first time, the Muslims were no longer hiding their faith. They were building a new society. The Prophet began with something remarkable. Before building strength, he built brotherhood. The Muhajirin, those who had left everything behind in Makkah, were paired with the Ansar, the people who welcomed them into Medina. One by one, every companion found a brother. Ali waited. Another name was called, then another. Soon, everyone had been paired. except him. Perhaps for a brief moment, he wondered if he had simply been forgotten. Then the Prophet walked toward him, took Ali by the hand, and said, "You are my brother in this world and the hereafter." No title, no position, no wealth could have meant more than those words. Years earlier, Ali had entered the Prophet's home as a little boy. Now, the Prophet publicly called him his brother. Not long afterward, the peace of Medina was tested. The people of Quraysh had not forgotten. Their caravans still crossed the desert, their pride was still wounded, and their determination to stop
Charge
Islam
forward.
had only grown stronger.
Attack!
The Muslims had never wanted war, but war found them. Then came Badr. For the first time, the believers stood before an army far larger than their own. 300 men facing nearly 1,000. Many of them had never fought a battle like this before. Ali stood among them. The little boy who once followed the Prophet through the streets of Makkah now stood beside him on the battlefield. The sword in his hand was new, but his loyalty was not. When the battle ended, victory belonged to the believers, not because they were stronger, but because Allah had fulfilled his promise. A year later, another army marched toward Medina. This time, the battlefield was Uhud. At first, the Muslims appeared to be winning. Then, everything changed. Some of the archers left their positions, confusion spread across the battlefield, and rumors raced through the fighting.
Get out of the way!
The Prophet has been killed.
I can't see anything!
For a few terrifying moments, many believed it. Some lost hope, others withdrew, but not everyone. Ali remained. He fought beside the Prophet while arrows fell around them and swords closed in from every direction. Loyalty was no longer quiet. It stood beneath flying arrows and drawn swords. Years earlier, the Prophet had protected Ali when he was only a child. Now, Ali was doing everything he could to protect the man who had raised him. History remembers the battle. I remember that moment, because it tells us something about Ali that no title ever could. Loyalty is easy when life is easy. Real loyalty reveals itself when staying means risking everything. Life in Medina continued. There were victories, there were losses, and there were ordinary days between them. One of those ordinary days changed Ali's life forever. He wished to marry Fatima, the beloved daughter of the Prophet. But Ali owned very little. He wasn't known for wealth. He wasn't the richest among the companions. Like many young men, he wondered whether what he had would ever be enough. When the Prophet learned of his intention, he did not ask about riches. He asked about character. Ali sold his armor to provide the mahr, and the marriage took place with remarkable simplicity. No palace, no luxury, no display of wealth. Just two people, beginning a life together. The same simplicity that had filled the Prophet's home now filled theirs. From that home came Hassan and Hussein, the grandchildren whom the Prophet loved with all his heart. Sometimes, the greatest legacies are not built inside palaces. Sometimes, they begin inside the smallest homes. The years passed. The Muslim community grew, revelation continued, and through every stage, Ali remained where he had always been, close to the Prophet. Not because history demanded it, but because love had placed him there long before history ever noticed. Then came the day no companion was ready to face. Prophet Muhammad became ill. The illness grew heavier until the day Allah called his messenger back to him. The city fell silent. Some companions could hardly believe what had happened. Others stood frozen in grief. For Ali, this loss reached somewhere even deeper. He was not only mourning the messenger of Allah, he was mourning the man who had raised him, the man whose home had become his home, the man whose character had shaped his own, the man he had followed since childhood. The grief was personal before it was historical. No battle had ever prepared him for that moment. Years later, Ali would become the fourth rightly guided Caliph. History remembers his leadership, his knowledge, his courage, his wisdom, and rightly so. But I don't think those things explain who Ali really was. If you want to understand Ali ibn Abi Talib, don't begin with the battles. Don't begin with the caliphate. Begin with a small house in Makkah. Begin with a little boy whose father could no longer carry every burden alone. Begin with one quiet act of gratitude, a man opening his home to the son of the man who had once opened his own. Because that is where this story truly begins. Long before Ali became a warrior, he became a witness. Long before he became a leader, he became a student. And long before the world remembered him as one of the greatest men in Islamic history, he was simply a little boy growing up beside the greatest man who ever lived. Perhaps that is why Ali never hesitated. Not when revelation came, not when persecution began, not when swords surrounded the Prophet's home, not when battles shook the Muslim community. Because his faith had never been built on extraordinary moments. It had been built across thousands of ordinary ones. One morning at a time, one conversation at a time, one example at a time. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson Ali leaves for all of us. Character is not formed overnight. It is formed by who we choose to walk beside, day after day, year after year.